A chilling wind howled through the towering trees as the rain fell in a steady, relentless drizzle. The small town of Ravenswood had always been quiet, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen until now. It started with a single coffin, lowered into the earth, but what followed left the entire town shaken to its core. At the funeral, everyone stood in silence, their black-clad figures barely moving as the priest recited his final prayers. The coffin belonged to Daniel Whitmore, a respected doctor who had passed away suddenly in his sleep. His wife, Margaret, stood beside it, her hands gripping the shoulders of their 6-year-old son, Ethan. The boy had been quiet throughout the entire ceremony, his tear-streaked face staring blankly ahead. But as the gravediggers prepared to lower the coffin, Ethan suddenly broke free from his mother's grasp. His tiny hand shot out, pointing directly at the wooden casket. His voice, small yet trembling with urgency, sent a shiver through everyone present. "Daddy's still inside. He's calling for help." A hushed murmur rippled through the mourners. Some glanced at each other, exchanging uneasy glances, while others shook their heads, assuming the child was simply struggling with grief. Margaret bent down, her fingers trembling as she tried to calm her son. "Sweetheart," she whispered, he's gone." But Ethan's lips quivered as he shook his head violently. "No, Mommy, he's not gone. He's screaming. He says it's dark and he can't breathe." The air around them thickened with unease. The priest, who had been standing with his hands clasped, took an involuntary step back. A gust of wind swept through the graveyard, making the candles flicker and the trees groan. The gravediggers hesitated, their shovels frozen in mid-air. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody spoke. Then, an elderly woman in the crowd gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "The boy can hear the dead." Margaret's breath hitched. Her heart pounded against her ribs as Ethan's small frame trembled beside her. And then, before she could stop him, the boy bolted toward the coffin, pounding his tiny fists against the wood. "Daddy, I'm here! I'll help you!" Panic surged through the crowd. A man in a dark suit, Daniel's brother Thomas, stepped forward, his face pale as he turned toward the funeral director. "Open it." The director hesitated. "That's impossible. The body was—" "I said, open it!" The tension snapped like a taut wire. The gravediggers exchanged hesitant glances before stepping forward. With hesitant, shaking hands, they pried the lid open. What they saw inside made several people gasp, while others turned away, unable to stomach the horror. Daniel Whitmore's hands were raw, his fingernails broken and bloodied from clawing at the lid. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. He had been buried alive. A deafening silence engulfed the graveyard. Margaret collapsed to her knees, her sobs breaking the eerie quiet. Thomas staggered backward, his face ghostly pale. But Ethan stood completely still, his wide, unblinking eyes fixed on his father's lifeless body. Slowly, he turned to his mother, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you, Mommy. He was calling for me." The wind howled once more, carrying with it a bone-chilling whisper, and as the last candle flickered out, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer than they should have. The air inside St. Michael's Church had grown thick with unease. Shadows flickered against the stone walls as the candles wavered, the dim light casting eerie shapes over the mourners. Clara felt the weight of every gaze in the room as she clutched Lucy's small hand, her daughter's words still ringing in her ears. "Papa hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for Mama." The murmurs had turned into hushed prayers, some of the older villagers making the sign of the cross, their faces pale. Margaret, an elderly woman who had known Clara since she was a child, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "A child so young doesn't lie about such things," she murmured, her expression grim. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse thudding against her temples. Lucy, still trembling, buried her face into her mother's dress, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric with desperation. Henry, standing a few feet away, forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "This is ridiculous," he said, though his hands were clenched into fists. "Children have vivid imaginations. She's grieving, that's all." But no one seemed convinced. The villagers kept their distance, their eyes darting from Lucy to the coffin, the fear in the room nearly suffocating. Madame Rose, the oldest in the village, shook her head. "Sometimes," she whispered, "children can see what we cannot." A shudder ran through Clara's spine. She wanted to believe this was just Lucy's way of coping, but something deep in her gut told her otherwise. She turned to Henry, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why are you so eager to settle Samuel's assets, Henry? He hasn't even been buried yet." Henry blinked rapidly, shifting his stance, he said, his tone overly controlled. "Samuel left debts. The house is mine." Clara cut him off, her grip on Lucy tightening. "And I won't be making any decisions today." Henry's jaw twitched. For a brief second, his carefully composed expression cracked, revealing something darker underneath. "You should be reasonable," he said, his voice dropping lower. "If you don't handle this now, I may have no choice but to involve the law." A cold chill ran down Clara's spine. She knew Henry wasn't just talking about legal matters. There was a veiled threat in his words. Before she could respond, Lucy's small, trembling voice cut through the silence again. "Papa is here." The room went deathly still. Lucy's wide eyes were locked onto the coffin, but then slowly her gaze drifted beyond it to the darkened corner of the church. A shadow moved, just barely, a flicker that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The candles flickered violently. A sudden gust of wind swept through the church, rattling the windows, and then, just as quickly as it came, the air stilled. But Clara felt it. Something was in that room with them. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the coffin. Lucy's words echoed in her mind, burrowing into her thoughts like a parasite. "Papa is stuck in there. He's calling me. He's scared." It was impossible. Samuel was dead. He had to be. But why, then, did a terrible sense of dread claw at her chest? Henry's hurried departure still lingered in her mind. The way he had stiffened, the subtle tremor in his voice. He wasn't just impatient about money. He was hiding something. Lucy's grip on her dress tightened. "Mama, please," she whimpered. "Papa is calling. We have to help him." A tremor ran down Clara's spine. She turned to Madame Rose, whose wrinkled hands trembled as she clutched her rosary. "You said you've seen this before," Clara whispered. "Tell me the truth." The old woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "There was a man," she finally murmured. "Years ago, they thought he was dead, but he was in a coma. His family buried him, only to be haunted by visions, by whispers in the dark. And then," her voice trailed off, her expression haunted. Clara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She turned to the villagers, her voice unsteady. Someone check the coffin." A heavy silence followed. No one moved. The fear was thick, suffocating. Margaret, standing closest to Clara, hesitated before speaking in a hushed voice. "If you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury him." Doubt? Clara's mind was a whirlwind. Did she doubt? Could she? She stumbled forward, reaching out, her fingers grazing the smooth, polished wood of the coffin. It was cold beneath her touch, unmoving, lifeless, yet a sickening thought curled in her stomach. What if he's still in there? Lucy let out a sudden wail, jerking away from Clara's grasp and pressing her tiny hands against the coffin. "Papa! Wake up! Please wake up!" The church seemed to breathe around them. The shadows stretching, the candlelight flickering violently. Then a sound, faint, so quiet that Clara almost thought she imagined it. A single thud from inside the coffin. Her breath hitched. The blood drained from her face. She staggered back, clutching Lucy to her chest. The villagers gasped, stepping away in horror. Someone murmured a prayer. Someone else whimpered. Madame Rose's voice was barely above a whisper. "God have mercy." Another thud, this time louder. Then, scratching, frenzied, desperate, a raw, strangled scream erupted from Clara's throat. "Open it! Open it now!" But no one moved. No one dared move. And then the scratching stopped. The coffin fell silent once more. The funeral had turned into a nightmare. The walls of St. Michael's Church seemed to close in on Clara as Matthew's words echoed in her mind. If anything ever happened to him, you shouldn't trust anyone. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The weight of Lucy in her arms grounded her, but the sickening realization clawed at her chest. Henry had pushed Samuel to sell the house. Samuel refused. And the next day, he had his accident. Clara clenched her fists. Was it truly an accident? Or something far more sinister? Lucy whimpered, her small hands gripping Clara's dress tightly. "Mama," she whispered, eyes filled with something beyond fear, something deeper. "Papa is still scared." A shudder ran through Clara's body. The coffin loomed before her, an ominous presence in the flickering candlelight. No, it wasn't possible. Samuel was gone. He had to be. Yet her heart screamed at her to listen. Margaret stepped closer, her voice low. "If you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury him." Clara turned to Matthew, her voice trembling. "We have to open the coffin." Gasps rippled through the villagers. Madame Rose clutched her rosary tighter, murmuring prayers under her breath. Someone in the back muttered, "This isn't right, the dead should be left in peace." But was he truly dead? Clara's stomach twisted into knots. A heavy silence stretched across the church, thick as fog. No one dared move. Then, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a thud from inside the coffin. Clara's breath hitched. Another thud. A scratch, then another, the sound of fingernails scraping desperately against wood. A strangled gasp escaped someone in the crowd. A woman clutched her chest and stepped back, nearly stumbling. Clara's entire body turned cold. "Oh, God!" Madame Rose whispered. Lucy's voice broke through the terrified silence. "Papa is awake!" Terror slammed into Clara with the force of a tidal wave. Her legs threatened to give way, but she forced herself to stay upright. "We have to open it," she choked out. The villagers stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. No one wanted to move. No one wanted to be the one to lift the lid. Clara turned to Matthew. "Help me." Matthew hesitated, only for a moment, before nodding. He rushed forward, grabbing a crowbar from the side of the church, likely used for maintenance. His hands shook as he wedged it under the coffin lid. The church doors slammed open with a sudden gust of wind. Candles flickered violently. Shadows danced on the walls. Lucy clung to Clara, her tiny voice trembling. "Hurry, Mama, he's scared." Matthew gritted his teeth, pressing down with all his strength. The wood groaned in protest. Then, with a sickening creak, the lid popped open, and what they saw inside made Clara's blood run cold. Madame Rose took a deep breath and spoke, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "If there is even the slightest chance that Samuel is alive, we must open the coffin." The air in St. Michael's Church was thick with fear, the flickering candlelight casting long, shifting shadows across the cold stone walls. The knocking had grown louder, undeniable, each thud sending fresh waves of terror through the gathered villagers. Clara's breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. Lucy clung to her dress, her tiny fingers digging into the fabric. "Mama, hurry," she whimpered. "Papa is calling for you." Henry's face twisted into an ugly mask of panic. "No one touches that coffin," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. James, the elderly villager, stepped forward, his weathered hands steady. "Then tell us, Henry, why are you so afraid?" His gaze was sharp, unwavering. "If this is just superstition, then prove it. Let us open it." Henry took a step back, his eyes darting wildly between the coffin and the villagers. He was losing control, his hands clenched at his sides, sweat dripping down his brow. Matthew, no longer waiting for permission, grabbed the crowbar again and wedged it beneath the coffin lid. Clara barely noticed Henry's frantic protests. Her entire world had shrunk to the sound of the wood creaking, splintering under pressure. The moment stretched unbearably. And then, with a final groan, the lid snapped open. Gasps and cries erupted throughout the church. Samuel's body lay inside, but something was horribly, terribly wrong. His fingers, bloodied and raw, were curled against the wooden lid. His face, once peaceful in death, was frozen in an expression of sheer, unfiltered terror. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been screaming. A single breathless moment passed. Then Margaret let out a strangled sob. Dear God, he was alive. Clara felt her knees buckle, the world around her blurred, voices distant and meaningless. No, 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 no. A guttural wail tore from her throat, raw and filled with agony. "Samuel!" Lucy sobbed beside her, reaching for the man who could no longer reach back. "Papa," she whimpered. Henry stumbled backward, his face ashen. I didn't." But no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Samuel, on the horrific truth laid bare before them. Madame Rose murmured, voice thick with sorrow. He wasn't taken by death, he was trapped in it. And in the silence that followed, the last candle on the altar flickered and went out. Ear-piercing wail as the final knock echoed through the church. Father Manuel recoiled, his face ashen. A murmur of horror spread through the villagers, some pressing their hands together in desperate prayer, others staring wide-eyed at the coffin, as though it might explode at any moment. Clara's breath was ragged, her chest heaving. It's real. The knocking wasn't an illusion. It wasn't grief playing tricks on her. It wasn't the wind. Samuel was inside that coffin. And he was still alive. "God help us," Margaret whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched her cloak. Matthew's jaw was tight with tension, his fists clenched at his sides. "Father, we can't wait any more." He turned to Clara, his voice firm. "We open it now." Father Manuel hesitated, his expression filled with doubt. This is unholy. The dead do not return." But Clara refused to listen to any more arguments. She turned to James and Matthew. "Help me." Together, they gripped the coffin's lid, ignoring Henry's choked protests from the floor. He lay sprawled out, his face battered and his eyes wild with terror. "You fools," he spat. "You have no idea what you're doing." Clara didn't care. She sucked in a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the wood. The coffin was heavy, sealed tightly, but with one last heave, the lid came free. A collective gasp echoed through the church. Samuel lay inside, his once peaceful expression now contorted in frozen horror. His fingers were curled, nails broken and bloodied, scratching desperately at the wood. His lips were cracked, his skin deathly pale, but his eyes were open, wide, staring, pleading. Terror seized Clara's heart, her vision swimming. "Samuel," she choked out. Lucy's small sobs filled the silence. "Papa." The villagers erupted into chaos. Some cried out in horror, others turned away, unable to bear the sight. Madame Rose fainted, collapsing into the arms of a nearby villager. Matthew reached out, pressing 2 fingers to Samuel's throat, his face pale and grim. A moment passed, the weight of eternity pressing down on them all. Then he shook his head. He's gone. No. Clara staggered back, her whole body trembling. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He had been alive. The knocking, he had been trying to escape to call for help. Her knees buckled. Samuel had been buried alive. A strangled cry tore from her throat. "No, no, no, no!" She grasped his lifeless hand, her own hands shaking violently. It was still warm. He had fought, he had struggled, and no one had heard him in time. Lucy let out a wail, burying her face into Clara's dress. James turned to Henry, his eyes dark with rage. "You knew." Henry's face had lost all colour, his body trembling. I didn't." Matthew's voice was like ice. "You did this." The villagers murmured in agreement, their faces turning from fear to anger. Henry stumbled backward, his eyes darting to the church doors. Then he ran, but he didn't make it far. Several men grabbed him before he could escape, dragging him back as he thrashed and screamed. "Let me go, I didn't do anything." Father Manuel's voice boomed over the chaos. "Silence!" The church fell deathly quiet once more. The priest stepped forward, his expression grave. "This is a crime against God and man," he declared. His eyes burned into Henry's. "You will answer for this." Henry whimpered, sweat dripping from his brow. But Clara didn't care about him anymore. She knelt beside Samuel, gripping his hand, pressing her forehead to his lifeless fingers. A sob racked her body, shaking her to the core. She had failed him. He had been calling for her, for Lucy, for anyone. And no one had come in time. Outside, the storm raged. The wind howled through the stained-glass windows. And in the flickering candlelight of St. Michael's Church, Clara wept for the man she had loved, the man who had died begging to be saved. But it was too late. With one final heave, Matthew and James wrenched the coffin lid open. A horrific gasp swept through the church as the flickering candlelight illuminated the body inside. Samuel's pale face was twisted in agony, his fingernails splintered and bloody from clawing at the wooden interior. His chest barely moved, his lips parted in a weak, rasping breath. Samuel was alive. Clara's heart nearly stopped. "Samuel!" she sobbed, reaching into the coffin. His body was cold, his breath shallow, but his eyelids fluttered ever so slightly. He was fighting. "Get him out, now!" Esteban shouted, rushing forward. Matthew and James worked quickly, lifting Samuel from the coffin as carefully as possible. Clara cradled his limp form, pressing frantic kisses to his forehead. "Samuel, it's me! It's Clara! I'm here!" Lucy clung to her father's arm, her tiny fingers trembling. "Papa?" A faint groan escaped Samuel's lips. The church erupted into chaos. Some villagers wept in relief, others recoiled in sheer terror, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Henry, however, let out a blood-curdling scream. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around wildly. No, this isn't real. He was supposed to be dead." Father Manuel's voice thundered through the church. "You buried a man alive, Henry. May God have mercy on your soul." Henry shrieked, turning to flee. only to be seized by Matthew and James. He struggled wildly, but there was nowhere left to run. Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced through the stained glass windows. Samuel coughed, his breath rattling, and Clara clutched his hand tightly. "You're safe now," she whispered. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto his cold skin. "I won't let you go." And this time, she would make sure he lived. The judge's gavel slammed against the podium, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "Henry Blackwood, you stand accused of fraud, attempted murder, and falsification of legal documents. How do you plead?" Henry's lips trembled. His once arrogant demeanour had crumbled. I never meant for this to happen," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthew clenched his fists, his rage barely contained. "You buried him alive, you coward," he spat. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Clara sat beside Samuel, gripping his hand. Though still frail, he sat upright, his presence a powerful testament to Henry's crimes. The prosecution presented the forged documents, the bribes Henry had paid, and the testimony of Dr. Esteban. The evidence was overwhelming. After hours of deliberation, the judge's voice rang through the tense silence. "Henry Blackwood, for your crimes, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison. May you find redemption behind bars." A cheer erupted from the villagers. Henry screamed, thrashing as officers dragged him away. "No! You can't do this! I didn't mean to." His pleas faded as he was taken from the courtroom. Clara exhaled, the weight of months of fear finally lifting. She turned to Samuel, who squeezed her hand weakly. "It's over," he whispered. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Yes, it's over." Lucy giggled, hugging them both. "Can we go home now?" Samuel smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yes, little one. We're finally going home." And as they stepped outside into the golden sunlight, Clara knew that no shadow of the past could ever take Samuel away from them again. Golden sunlight bathed the Herrera home in a warm glow. The fields stretched endlessly before them, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Samuel stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing, his hand clasped firmly in Clara's. His body was still recovering, but his heart was lighter than it had been in a long time. Lucy ran across the yard, her laughter ringing through the air as she chased a butterfly. Her joy was infectious, a melody of innocence and hope. "We're really home," Clara whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the land before them. "Yes," he said softly, "we are." A month had passed since the trial. Henry was gone, locked away for his crimes. The town had moved on, whispering his name less and less with each passing day. The horror of what had happened still lingered, but it no longer held them captive. Life was moving forward. Clara turned to Samuel, studying the man she had almost lost forever. There were still faint shadows in his eyes, reminders of the nightmare he had endured, but there was also strength, an unbreakable will to live. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with love. "Thank you," Samuel whispered, "for never giving up on me." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were tears of relief. "I would have searched forever," she murmured. Lucy ran up to them, her small arms wrapping around both their legs. "We're a family," she said brightly. "No one can take us apart anymore." Clara knelt down, pulling Lucy into a warm embrace. "That's right, my love. We will always be together." Samuel crouched beside them, his hand brushing gently over his daughter's hair. "And I will never leave you again." The wind rustled the trees, carrying away the last remnants of fear. The darkness had passed, and in its place was light, a future built on love, truth, and resilience. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the Herrera family stood together, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already won the greatest battle of all. Some wounds might never fully fade, but love would always be their strongest shield. Justice had been served, and life had given them a second chance. They would cherish it forever.